So in the previous chapter, we looked at the supply in a perfectly competitive industry, and we distinguished what happens at the level of the firm and the level of the industry. And now let's look at the completely opposite case when there is only one producer in the industry, a monopolist. In that case, what happens at the firm level will be the same as what happens at the level of the industry, and there will be a small difference between what a competitive producer would do and what a monopolistic producer does. So in a perfectly competitive case, we implicitly we assumed that the price in the marketplace was given. The producer didn't have to care, could not influence the price in the marketplace, and the decision of the producer was simple: to choose its output level given the price in the market. On the other hand, in the monopolistic industry, the producer chooses both its output level and the price for its product. So, as a numerical example, suppose that this is the demand schedule for the monopolist, where depending on the price that occurs in the market, consumers are willing to buy different amount of product, water in this case. Using this demand schedule, we can calculate how much revenue the monopolist could collect from charging a particular price and supplying particular amount of water in the marketplace. And using this total revenue, we can calculate average revenue simply by dividing this total revenue by output, and marginal revenue as the additional revenue from producing one more unit of output. We can see that average revenue is the same as price for a monopolist, right? We're assuming that all consumers are charged the same price, and so to obtain total revenue, we simply multiplied quantity supplied times price, and to obtain average revenue, we divide total revenue by quantity. So intuitively, we should get the same value for average revenue as for price. On the other hand, for marginal revenue, we get numbers which are strictly lower than price. And the intuition here is that whenever the company produces one more unit of output, there are two effects on the revenues of the monopolist: the output effect and the price effect. The output effect is that when the company sells one more unit of water, it gets to collect one more price for the additional unit. That's the output effect. On the other hand, there is a price effect, because in order to sell an additional unit of water, the company has to decrease the price in the market, and it has to decrease the price for all existing consumers. So from producing the second unit of water, notice that the company cannot keep the price level at 10, it has to decrease price to 9. And so the output effect of producing the second unit of water is the company can collect $9 more from the second consumer, but the monopolist gives up $1 from the first consumer of water. And its additional revenue is only $8 rather than $9, which is the price. So graphically, we can summarize that marginal revenues of a monopolist are strictly below the price line or the demand curve in the market. To give you a little bit more information here, if we have a linear demand curve, then the marginal revenue curve will also be linear, and it will be twice as steep. So if we observed that the intercept of the demand curve occurred at a particular point on the graph, then we would find that the marginal revenue curve intersects the horizontal axis at exactly half of the output level. And to understand this graph intuitively, this graph tells us that for all these output levels, when the company produces them, total revenues increase. But as soon as marginal revenues become negative, producing additional units of output would decrease revenues of the company. So thinking about the output effect and the price effect of the quantity that the monopolist chooses, you should think that for these units of output, the output effect is more important than the price effect. And for these output levels, the price effect becomes greater, even though the monopolist produces more units of output. It has to lower prices so much that total revenues fall. And an additional piece of information, so as I said, the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as the demand curve, which means that there is a difference between units of output on this side of the demand curve and units of output on this side of the demand curve. Here, this discussion should remind you of Chapter 5, when we said that for a perfectly linear demand curve, price elasticity of demand in the middle of the demand curve is exactly 1 or -1 with the correct sign. On this side of the demand curve is elastic, and on this side of the demand curve, the demand is inelastic. And we said that when the demand curve is elastic, when the company produces more output and lowers its price, its total revenues increase. And for these units of output, when the demand curve is inelastic, selling more units at lower prices decreases total revenues of the producer. And that's exactly what we observe when we draw the marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. For all of these units, total revenues increase. For these units, total revenues decrease as more is produced. Using the same graphs as in the previous chapter, that means that total revenue curve is an inverse U-shaped now, right? That's different from perfectly competitive markets when total revenues were strictly increasing in the output produced. Now we would say that total revenues are maximized at the level where marginal revenues are 0. And total revenues would be increasing for previous units of output and decreasing for all following units of output. And we have the same on the supply side. We can assume the same cost structure as for perfectly competitive firms. So there is nothing new on the supply side. The only difference comes from the revenue side for the monopolist. Okay? And again, we can observe that there are ranges of output when total profits are negative, when total profits are positive. That happens when total revenue is greater than total cost. We can say that as long as total revenues are steeper than total costs, profits are increasing, when total revenues become flatter or negatively sloped, and when the total cost curve is relatively steep, total profits are decreasing. And we can summarize that total profits are maximized when the difference between total revenues and total costs is maximized. And in other words, that happens when the slope of the total revenue curve is the same as the slope of the total cost curve. So just like in the previous chapter, we can say that the profit maximizing decision is for the monopolist to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost of production. Drawing the same discussion on a graph with dollars per unit, we can draw the demand curve, marginal revenue curve, and marginal cost curve of production. And like we said, a profit maximizing monopolist would choose output where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost of production. And so far we said that the company would stop, the monopolist would stop producing at this output level. What will happen to the price in the market? Well, you should think that if this limited amount of output is thrown into the market, notice that for this output level, consumers are willing to pay high amount of money. So you can think that the consumers in the market will bid up among themselves, will bid up the price to this high level. And we would say that this point, point B, is the market solution. So to summarize, we have found the profit maximizing output level for the monopolist by setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, and then we let consumers bid among themselves to purchase this limited quantity, and that means that the monopoly price happens at this level. Okay, and finally, we can look at the difference between this price, which is the average revenue of the monopolist, and the average total cost of the monopolist to derive profits that the monopolist earns. Okay, how does this compare to a perfectly competitive outcome? Well, in a perfectly competitive industry, we would say that this is the market outcome, where marginal cost is equal to price or average revenue, and looking at welfare that results in the market, we can conclude that between the competitive outcome and the monopolistic outcome, consumers become worse off under monopoly. Consumer surplus falls from this larger triangle to this smaller triangle. So consumers lose some area in their consumer surplus. What happens to producer surplus? Producer surplus used to be this triangle in a competitive industry, and now producer surplus is a higher, so this area for producer surplus becomes higher, but slightly narrower. So perhaps producer surplus increased in the case of monopoly. But notably, this triangle here, which used to go to consumers and producers as their surplus, now doesn't go to anybody. Now these units are not produced, so nobody gets welfare from them. We can say that a deadweight loss of monopoly results. As a small side note, when we compare profits, you might be confused about the difference between the profit that monopoly earns and the producer surplus. Remember that monopoly profit is the difference between total revenues, variable costs, and fixed costs of production. Producer surplus is the difference between revenues and variable costs of production, because marginal cost curve only tells us the variable costs of production. So if we drew producer surplus in this graph, we would get a little bit different amount than profit for the monopolist because of fixed costs of production. We can say that the difference between profits and producer surplus of a company is the fixed cost of production. Okay. So to summarize what has happened when we moved from a competitive industry to a monopolistic industry, we see that consumers are made worse off, producer is made better off because the producer earns greater surplus, greater profit. But by trying to redistribute some surplus from consumers to himself, the monopolist created some inefficiency. So in this effort of redistributing surplus to himself, some welfare in the market was lost. And we could say that this deadweight loss of monopoly is similar to the deadweight loss that we discussed for government intervention in the market. Once again, if the government cares about efficiency in the market, maybe the government would want to intervene in a monopolistic market to correct for this newly created, this new inefficiency. There are several possibilities that the government has. One is to make monopolies more competitive. The government could encourage entry into the marketplace. The government sometimes splits large monopolists into several smaller companies that would compete with each other. Another possibility is to regulate the behavior of monopolies. Again, from the previous discussion, you could think that the government can use command and control policies or market-based policies. So the government could regulate prices that the monopolist charges or regulate output level. The government could dictate to the monopoly to produce large output level at low enough prices. Or the government could tax or subsidize the monopolist to achieve a more efficient outcome. We will discuss that in the next few minutes. Finally, some other possibilities are to turn private monopolies into public enterprises. There are some issues with this solution as well. The chapter in the textbook describes some issues with publicly owned companies. Another possibility is do nothing at all. If the deadweight loss is small enough, perhaps because market demand, market supply curves are sufficiently inelastic, the triangle for deadweight loss could be narrow enough that the government might give up on reducing that inefficiency. And we will say at the end that one possibility would be to allow the monopolist to price discriminate, because we will say that if the monopolist can charge different prices to different consumers, he would face only the output effect in his decision to choose quantities, but no price effect. When the monopolist decreases price for additional consumers, it would not have to lower prices of existing consumers, so he would not face the price effect, and he would not have an incentive to reduce quantity in the market as much as without price discrimination. We will talk about that a little bit. Okay, so looking at the demand curve, marginal revenue curve, and the marginal cost curve of a monopolist, and for now please ignore the yellow lines, I want you to think that one way to regulate the monopolist would be to set a price cap or a price ceiling that the monopolist can charge, or to regulate minimum output level that the monopolist can produce. And in this way, using this command and control policy, the government could remove the inefficiency from monopoly. How about market-based policies such as taxes? What if we taxed the output of the monopolist? Well, this would not work actually. Remember that taxes on suppliers shift the supply curve upward, and so if we shifted the marginal cost curve or the supply curve of the monopolist upward, the new intersection of the marginal cost and marginal revenue curve would occur up and to the left of the original point. So the inefficiency in the market would even increase. Even less output would be produced compared to the efficient level. So taxation of output would not work to fix inefficiency from monopoly. On the other hand, subsidy could work. If we offered the monopolist subsidy to produce output, the supply curve would effectively fall, and the new intersection, it could happen that the new intersection of the marginal cost curve and marginal revenue curve would occur exactly at the efficient level of output, so that the inefficiency could be removed. Another type of taxation that the government might consider is taxing profit rather than output level. If the government is only concerned with redistribution of welfare between consumers and the monopolist, but not about the inefficiency from monopoly, we could show that the government could take some of the profits of a monopolist away and maybe distribute them back to consumers without influencing the monopolist output decision. So using the marginal revenue and marginal cost curve, we can draw the marginal profit curve of the monopolist. That's just the difference between those two. And suppose that the government decides to tax, suppose 20% of monopoly profits. In that case, the marginal profit curve would fall by 20%. Right? Effectively, every time the monopoly produces 1 unit of output and experiences some marginal profit, these marginal profits would be smaller by 20% compared to the no tax situation. But because the tax on profits is in terms of percentage of profits, the marginal profit curve would still intersect the horizontal axis at the same output level. So we would still get the property that the monopolist would want to produce all of these units of output and would not want to produce these additional units of output, both without the tax on profits and with the tax on profits. So the conclusion from this graph is that if the government is concerned about welfare consequences of monopoly, the government could succeed in redistributing some of the surplus from the monopoly to consumers. But using taxes on profits, the government would not succeed in removing the inefficiency from monopoly. Okay. Finally, let's, at the end of the chapter, there is a small discussion of natural monopolies and then price discrimination by monopolies. Natural monopoly is an industry or company which has continuously falling average total cost curve, either because of large fixed costs of operation or variable costs that are lower and lower per unit with greater output levels. We might observe this average total cost curve. With this kind of company, we could again observe how much a competitive industry would produce, how much a monopolistic company would produce, and at what prices. If we draw the demand curve in the market and the corresponding marginal revenue curve for a monopolist, we would observe that a monopolist would want to produce this output level at this price. Perfectly competitive industry would compete the price down all the way to the level of marginal costs. But the problem with the perfectly competitive outcome, which we would say is the efficient outcome, is that at this output level, companies are not covering their total costs of production. Notice that average revenues do not cover the entire average total costs of production. If the government wanted to achieve this efficient output level, it would have to subsidize the providers in some way. One way would be to offer per unit subsidy. So effectively, the government could decrease the marginal costs faced by companies from this level by the amount of the subsidy to this lower level. And if this per unit subsidy is large enough, the intersection of the monopolists' marginal revenue and marginal cost curve could occur exactly where, exactly at the efficient level of output. But you may think that this could be a very expensive program, because in this case the government would have to offer this per unit subsidy times this output level. So the cost of this subsidy would be this large rectangle here. Alternatively, the government could impose a quota or command and control instrument. The government could require the monopolist to produce this output level, and the government could compensate for the losses that the monopolist would obtain. So the government could offer this lump sum subsidy to the monopoly, just so that the monopolist would achieve zero profit. Okay. Finally, a third possible solution is that maybe these government programs are not feasible. Maybe taxpayers would not be willing to pay these subsidies to a monopolist. The government could find a compromise between the monopoly outcome and the perfectly efficient outcome. For example, at the average cost pricing outcome. The government could require the monopolist to produce this output level at these prices, where average revenue of the company is exactly equal to the average total cost of production. So the producer achieves zero profits, and the producer would decide to stay in the market. And you can think that this outcome is not as bad as the unregulated monopoly outcome. So you may think that average cost pricing could be a good compromise in real-world situations when more efficient outcomes are too expensive or politically impossible. Okay, the final topic in this chapter is on price discrimination. In general, you should think that prices don't have to be constant in the marketplace. Companies can offer different prices to different consumers. We can distinguish three kinds of price discrimination. First degree or perfect price discrimination happens when every consumer can face a different price, or in general, when every unit of output that is sold in the market can be sold for a different price. I will give you a handout on this form of price discrimination, along with examples when we observe this form of price discrimination in the real world. Second degree price discrimination, usually we say that happens when the producer offers quantity discounts or quality premiums for certain consumers. And then the producer allows consumers to self-select themselves into how much quantity or how much quality to purchase. So in that case, the producer offers different bundles, different quantities at different prices, and consumers, based on their willingness to pay and ability to pay, choose whether they want to buy larger quantity at lower average prices or smaller quantity at higher average prices. Or consumers choose how much quality they want from their product. They can choose higher quality products for higher prices or lower quality products for lower prices. So the important property about second degree price discrimination is that consumers self-select. There are these bundles available. The provider doesn't force consumers to select any particular bundle. It lets consumers to choose. Third degree price discrimination is in a way similar to first degree price discrimination. It happens when there are easily identifiable different groups of consumers. And the monopolist can charge different groups of consumers different prices. In the real world, you can think that there are sometimes men and women face different prices, children, adults face different prices, and these are situations when the monopolist can charge different prices to different consumers based on consumers' different willingness to pay. Okay? So let's look at the simple example of perfect price discrimination. In that case, if the monopolist faces this market demand curve, the monopolist doesn't have to charge the same price to all consumers. So if a consumer has a very high willingness to pay, the monopolist can charge this consumer a price all the way up to the consumer's willingness to pay. And for a consumer with lower willingness to pay, the monopolist might charge him lower price to extract as much of consumer surplus as possible. And so the nice and the important property of price discrimination is that the monopolist doesn't face the price effect when he chooses how much of the product to supply. When the monopolist decides to cater to this marginal consumer, the monopolist doesn't have to lower prices faced by previous consumers, right? For the non-price discriminatory case, we said that the monopolist would stop producing at this output level. It's because the output effect was somehow balanced with the price effect that the monopolist was facing. with price discrimination, the monopolist would find it profit maximizing to produce all of these output levels, because even for these output levels, consumers' willingness to pay is above the costs of production. And so the monopolist would only stop producing at this output level, which turns out to be the perfectly competitive or efficient output level. Talking about welfare in that situation, remember that without price discrimination, we would say that the producer surplus or the profit of the monopolist is this rectangle here. Consumer surplus is this triangle here. Without price discrimination, we had deadweight loss. Now with price discrimination, all of these units will be produced. All of this area will be given to the monopolist as his profit, because the monopolist will charge prices equal to willingness to pay of each consumer. And so you may think that the deadweight loss will disappear. There will not be any inefficiency anymore. And all of the consumer surplus will be converted to producer surplus. So somewhat surprisingly, we find that when the monopolist can price discriminate, he not only increases his own profits, but he also reduces or eliminates the inefficiency in monopolistic markets. So in terms of welfare, we might be worried that with price discrimination, the monopolist gets more of the industry surplus for himself. But from an efficiency point of view, we might like price discrimination because there are no resources wasted in the marketplace.